Hi, this presentation is about transition and how areas of intensification can be buffered from residential neighborhoods. Residential neighborhoods find themselves surrounded today by busy main streets and intensification. And what's important here is to recognize there is a transition line that occurs between neighborhoods and the surrounding development areas. Is to provide this type of picture where the neighborhoods are buffered from the intrusions of developments such as the neon project seen here on the right. It's important to note that that transition line does occur in these areas of intense development and not in the residential neighborhoods, and we can get these types of setbacks as we see here in the solution at Berwick and Duplex. Here we're looking at a panorama from the residential neighborhoods turning around at Duplex and Orchard View. And now we see in the northeast corner there the apartment neighborhood with the existing Stanley Knowles Co-op Tower, the library facility, and in the foreground the parking lot that will turn into the neon site. This development on this corner will be the transition to the neighborhood that we're standing in. We can see from the scale of its magnitude that it is a very intense building. Here's Orchard View Boulevard as we'll look at in more detail, and to our right appearing on the screen is the Young Eglinton Center, which is again another development zone where there is expected to be intensification and great mass and height. And this development, this part was done in 1975, but if we put the neon in its place, we see that it even encroaches closer to the sidewalk, is of the same height, and it is built proud of the line of those towers that exist there today. With intensification occurring throughout the city in these mixed-use areas, apartment neighborhoods and centers, it's important to see that we do protect our residential neighborhoods. The red dot here represents the neon, the light yellow area is the residential neighborhood, the dark brown are apartment neighborhoods, and the red is the mixed-use area. So the sites that are of interest to neon in terms of comparison, developments in the vicinity of the neon that one should take note of include the Stanley Knowles Tower beside it and the library, which has a density overall of 3.4, and up on Erskine Avenue we have a development and transition location where it's at 3.4, and in the lower left we see the Duplex Berwick corner at 4.1. And then if we look at an apartment building on a similar size site totally within an apartment neighborhood, the Minto Roehampton has density of 5.6. One of the most important things in terms of establishing transition here is angular plane. We're going to look now in section. We see here a residential neighborhood to the left, apartment neighborhood heights to the right, and the angular plane here establishes this transition. And we can see therefore that we're keeping buildings close to residential neighborhoods in the same scale as neighborhoods works, and then the transition angle goes up from there. Now if we look at this again where there's a street in place, we see the same provisions occur, and all this is to make sure that we have sky view, sunlight, and openness that's included in our city. The neon in turn though actually arises above the angular plane. Yes, it does say it has some setback to it, but ultimately the questions arise as to how it handles height, density, setback, step back, and open space. In these studies here we can see how the angular planes, if they are applied to the neon, actually sculpt back this space. How do we enhance our sky view in the city and have magnitude? In part, we see here that we do our towers taller and slimmer. And we see here that the level area is the actual street allowance, and then the building on the left is part of this modern complex, but the front yard areas are within the property of that development, different from the neon, which actually encroaches into the street allowance. Now if we look at the interior of how should the library block really be planned? If we're talking about planning, not just development. You can see here the consequences of the neon in terms of its impacts upon its immediate neighbors, the library, and the Stanley Knowles Tower. And these come down to issues of view and skylight and how they impose upon these adjacent properties. Standing in the library, which is designed with this panoramic view that wraps around and you can see the whole of the block in its surrounds. We see out the windows there the parking lot that used to be houses, which will be the neon site. And moving further back into the library, again we see this from a different angle out the windows. And now we're looking at the view as it has been, looking out into residential houses and the view distances and the amount of skylight provided. I'm going to render this so that we see it with the neon bulk put in place. And at first again we see the residential density and setbacks. Now we see the mask of the wall that is projecting straight up from the property line, blocking out the view, and it does have, again, consequences as to the amount of light. And behind here we can see this is where the parking lot had been, and now at the very front of the property the neon ends, and again you have the view. Line at the edge of the intense areas. The black square is the neon site on the corner, and the library shape is shown there with its tower on top. And here again we can see where there are issues within the block of space, streetscape, space to the houses to the north, height, setback, magnitude of the whole thing, and the distance between the two towers. If we were planning ahead, we'd realize that the library takes up the mid and most important portion of the block, and a large portion of it. There are two development sites available, Neon and Young, and how these can merge together. And what we want to look at is how we can consolidate all these together to get a good public realm to balance against the amount of intensity on top. Looking at this public realm at grade condition, parking lot site, which will become the Neon, and there's the library and the co-op tower, and we see Orchard View Boulevard. Now if we stand on Orchard View Boulevard within the block, we can see the neighborhood behind, the Neon site on the corner butting right up against the library, and then with the library we see that it is set back from the street itself. And now as we look at Orchard View Boulevard, we become aware of the amount of intense development upon it, and this phenomenal amount of access required to parking and loading docks. If we map these, we can see in black here all the truck loading accesses that occur along Orchard View Boulevard, and again on Helendale to the north on the block to give an idea of proportion. And in the orange we see the number of car ramps. Here we see the street in action and the amount of trucking, cars, pedestrian movements, and you'll notice as well as a complicated street and the movements of these vehicles and people take off in different angles. So ultimately it comes down to how do we handle this transition and protect our neighborhoods, and it comes down to planning for it. And in this block, for instance, there are two development potential sites, and it's a case of how these are partnered to come to a good solution. Our biggest problem and the challenge we have with the Neon is here we have a development that has immediately, ambitiously gone after the intensification that's possible in the block. However, we have not planned for it within the block, and if we don't do this planning and get the consolidation and the balance, then we end up with these confrontations. And what we see here in the Neon, which is the most oversized building that North Toronto has ever seen relative to what is permitted, these same intrusions will be introduced into other areas as well. What do we do about intensification and transition in our neighborhoods? It's very simple. We need to draw the line. It's not being drawn by planning today. Our neighborhoods basically are being approached by development ventures, and we must be able to turn around to them and recognize those that are performing properly and those which are not. It's all about defining this transition line, and what we want to see in our residential neighborhoods, that we reinforce the character of the neighborhood within the intensification zone beside them, along that edge. And in doing this, we must recognize the neighborhood interests, but as well that in these areas of intensification, that they are appropriate. What should the focus be of attention? It's not those towers and densities above, but really, as long as they match those requirements that are basic, it is a case of then focusing in upon the principal levels near grade. And one thing to do in terms of expanding the public realm is, in many of the mixed-use areas, is identifying the fact that the public realm extends not only from grade but to the level below, which in many cases takes us into the transit, and again to the level above grade. We're about to arrive upon the development of the Eglinton Transit Corridor, which is a mixed-use ribbon throughout the city, on sides of which are all the residential neighborhoods. This is where intensification is supposed to occur, and we will see considerable amount of development occurring over time here. What is important is how they relate to the neighborhood edge. So if we actually take out the main corridor and we take out the back neighborhood area and we look at the interface between intensification and neighborhoods, this is where we have to establish the edge. So in this regard, the Neon is key critical to establishing the transition edge as it will be applied throughout development.